listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with The Briefing. You might be one of the 2.5 million Australians that tuned into the first episode of MAFS this year.
I could be set in my ways, always thinking men should be men and women be women.
Please don't try and clean up after dinner or help with the laundry.
I want this experiment to work for us and I'm going to give you my all.
I also don't have any intentions of doing an OnlyFans account.
But even if you're not watching, this season is raising a lot of ethical questions around the producing of reality shows like MAFS, with critics saying some of the behaviour and toxic relationships shown on the show are going too far. But how much of what we are watching is real and what is constructed? Alexandria Funnell is an ex-MAFS post-producer and co-host of the podcast That's Showbiz Baby. Alex, should we be making shows like MAFS?
Oh, that's a question that I don't know if I'm the voice of society that gets to decide, should we? That's like saying, should we eat McDonald's? Should we drink alcohol? You know, there are lots of very guilty pleasures that we have in terms of from a media perspective. The media will always produce content that people want to watch. And if the viewers are still watching it, the media will keep making it. So in terms of should we do it? I think so, yeah, if we want TV to keep going.
Yeah, and it does have a big appetite in Australia. It's our most watched reality TV show that we kind of produce locally. But we have over the years seen some pretty poor behaviour from participants on the show. Everything from heated arguments to violent outbursts, with some people saying that we shouldn't be entertaining scenes like this on national TV. What do you think of that?
I agree with you. There are a lot of incredibly poor behaviour that is displayed on shows like Married at First Sight. My question is, though, is it Married at First Sight's responsibility to shield the public from the truth of what does often go on behind the scenes in relationships? What you're seeing on Married at First Sight is what I would argue a pretty accurate reflection of the shocking behaviour that goes on within relationships behind closed doors, on the dating scene. The reason it triggers people so much and is so shocking is because it's relatable and people know I've been there. And so I almost think that Married at First Sight has a responsibility to show Australia how people are behaving in relationships. It's not pretty, but I bet if you put a camera in half the houses around the country, it wouldn't be pretty either.
Before we do get into some of the current controversies surrounding the season, how is a show like MAFS produced?
It's so complicated. I think people really want to think that there is a really clear-cut answer of, is this the truth? Is it not the truth? Is this fabricated? People want a really clear answer, but there is no clear answer. If I was to sum it up in the clearest way possible, I would say it's definitely not a documentary and it's definitely not scripted. So it's somewhere in between. It's a heightened version of reality. And I don't think that that is that salacious. Nobody watching the show would think this is everything that goes on because it's just impossible. But is it a reflection and an amplification of things that do happen on the show and between the participants? Absolutely. Is it produced? Of course. Each couple is assigned a producer. Each couple has conversations. It's the producer's job and a TV show's job to entertain. And so the most interesting angle and the most interesting story is always going to be pursued.
So the show sounds like it's really heavily produced, like each couple having their own producer. Is the storylines, though, they don't feel natural sometimes? Are they produced to the level of they're getting scripted or they're getting words fed to them, like lines fed into their mouths?
I used to be a post-producer on MAFS, and essentially what that means is we as a team go through all the footage that is sent to us from the day, and we go through it with a fine-tooth comb and essentially find the most interesting angle of what happened on that day. It could be a small thing that maybe is exaggerated a little bit. It could be a big thing that is just exists there, but we're always led by what actually happens. In terms of what happens between the participants and their producers on set, there is a disconnect, I would say, between production and post-production. So whatever is going on off camera, post-producers are not privy to. If it didn't happen on camera, it doesn't matter. because we can't show that on screen and it doesn't mean anything to the audience unless we have footage of it. So in terms of other lines being fed, because I obviously listen to a lot of the interviews and you can hear the producer talking. The producer is just asking questions, and they're asking questions in the same question sometimes in several different ways to make sure that they're getting a certain answer. For example, wow, I know you said coming in that you were really looking for X and this person is really sort of behaving in a way that's the complete opposite to that. You must be feeling really disappointed by that. Like, can you talk me through that? That is a leading question. So that does happen, of course, because you've got to get the participants in an environment where they're sharing something vulnerable. And at the end of the day, the participants are in relationships with each other. They are being intimate. They are being physical. They are in real relationships and they are talking about vulnerable things. They're talking about whether they've had sex with their partner, whether they've been cheated on. It's vulnerable things and there needs to be an established dynamic. And part of a story producer's job is to create that dynamic. And the way that is done is by questions like that. It's also, there would be genuine friendships that go on between the producer and the participants because the producer is assigned to them for the entire time. And the producers aren't these evil freaks. They're just people like you and me, that know they have a job to do, but also they probably get along with the contestants sometimes. I don't know. I'm not a production producer, but a lot of the people I've spoken to, that's sort of the vibe I get.
The show is put together in a really captivating way. They do a good job. They know what they're doing. The sound, the music, the B-roll, the sneaky cuts to the contestant talking that just match perfectly. And as you said, it is such a vulnerable show. You're having a relationship with someone you've just met. It's a strange concept. But the thing that I think a lot of people talk about online is the edits, because there's clearly villains. There's the ones you're meant to fall in love with, the ones that you're unsure about. You don't know if they're going to be a villain or a good guy. In a show like this, does someone really get a bad edit?
See, I would think that referring to the villain or the bad edit, I think that the behaviour of the participant leads that way. There's just no world that exists where this lovely, self-reflective, kind, compassionate person who has a balanced perception of themselves and other people and can apply logic and grace and all those things are going to come in and the producers are going to be like, ha, 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 let's make them the villain. The villain, so to speak, and we don't really refer to them like that. The audience calls them that. The villain, so to speak, is for the most part just led by the person's genuine behaviour. And so I do find that a little strange when they come out and completely blame the edit. I think that a more reasonable thing for a villain to say would be, look, watching myself back was hard. I admit there were some things that I did that I'm not proud of. I've definitely learned and grown from this experience. I have to admit there were a lot of things that were either taken out of context or there wasn't as much context around my reaction that there could have been. But at the end of the day, I still did do those things. I still did say those things and I still made my partner upset. That's something that I have to work on. That's something I have to live with. The villains never say that. The villains never acknowledge that they have, well, I can't say never, but rarely acknowledge, oh, you know what? I do have some problematic behaviours. They're always like, look at that Franken grab. That Franken grab proves that I'm not a bad person. But two truths can exist. There can be Franken grabs and things taken a little bit out of context or not like enough of a context around it. And you can still be a dickhead,
And arguably you do need these kind of villain characters, as people call them, on the show to create drama, to create reality TV. So is this not part of the casting of a show like MAFS to have someone that is going to create a bit of controversy?
I've never worked in casting, but I do believe from just a producing perspective, you'd lean towards the people who have strong personalities. it doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be a villain. Sometimes people with strong personalities are really well liked because of their strong personality. But there's no denying that a strong personality on television is more entertaining than just a neutral person who doesn't have an opinion on anything, who just goes with the flow and just doesn't react. They're probably not going to get cast because that doesn't make television. That being said, that kind of person probably doesn't want to be on TV. The reality is it's the strong personalities with strong opinions and outlandish kind of tendencies that are leaning towards wanting to go on these shows, which is why you end up with a high proportion of people who are behaving in a way that we consider to be outlandish, intense, inappropriate, or whatever. It's because it's a mutually beneficial relationship for the show and the participants in some respects.
Going to some of the ethics and morals that go into producing a show like MAFS, you mentioned this before with the producers. Do you have to be some cold-hearted person to be a producer? Do people who work on these shows have conversations about the ethics of the content they're making, the edits and the choices of what they're choosing to air?
I think about this a lot. I can only speak from my experience and my perspective. Before I worked on Married at First Sight, I had worked on lots of other shows which I would say didn't really raise any ethical kind of dilemmas. It was pretty neutral shows. And I was always a fan of Married at First Sight though. Like most of Australia, I love to watch the show. So when I was given the opportunity to work on the show, I put my hand up and was excited to work on the show. I personally wasn't ever faced with a situation where I was producing scenes that was putting people in a questionable or morally ambiguous situation. Everything that I post-produced, was a pretty accurate reflection of the behaviour of the people. So I could sleep at night quite well. I only did 2 seasons. I don't think I would have it in me to do it continuously. But also that being said, I always said that I had the luxury of not being a production producer. So I'm not faced with the people. I'm kind of like a keyboard warrior in a way because I'm not seeing people face to face and then getting all these complex kind of versions of events that you have to kind of manipulate people to their faces. I don't know if that's what happens, but I have been told by some participants, because over the last few weeks, participants have been messaging me, telling me what the on-set producers did to them. And I'm like, well, if that's true, that doesn't sound that good, to be honest. But I haven't really been privy to that personally, so I can't speak on it. In terms of my personal ethics, I think I pushed them a little bit, but not so far that I couldn't sleep at night, and I don't do it anymore. If you work in media, you've always got to ask yourself, is publishing this story going to ruin this person's life? Is publishing this story a completely accurate interpretation of events? It's a question that every journalist, every producer, every media person has to ask themselves. And sometimes we do publish things that we know aren't going to bode well for the person who is being spoken about. But if it's still kind of the truth or a somewhat version of the truth, I don't know. It's a wider question that the media probably needs to ask themselves.
When people sign up to the show, you've spoken about this before. What happens to their rights after the show is aired and their control of the public's perception on who they are?
I haven't seen their contracts, but from what I've been told, the contracts are pretty ironclad. Once they've aired, no one's editing them anymore. And they just go out into the real world and they exist as they are. And pretty soon, people make their own informed judgments about whether these people really were the villain or not. Often, the notorious villains who got the terrible edit go out unproduced and they show their cards. None of them ever really come out and are these great people that, the edit was so wrong about them. They kind of double down on their character in a way. I mean, I can't speak for every person who's ever gotten the bad edit quote, but once this show is aired, they're no longer being produced. So whatever they are is who they are.
You mentioned earlier that these shows can highlight toxic relationship behaviours that we might see or probably do see behind closed doors in an everyday house, but there's just no cameras there. In this particular season, there's a lot of talk about traditional relationships and gender norms between men and women. What some people online have been describing as outdated perspectives on masculinity. Does a show like MAFS have a responsibility to not platform these kinds of people on their program who might be seen as problematic?
Yes, there is a section of the internet that is saying that it's outdated, but you can't deny that there's a growing section of the internet trad wives, which is also growing, the Andrew Tate's the trad wife type thing. And I would say that Married at First Sight is currently just a reflection of what exists in society currently, in terms of there is that sentiment of traditional gender roles and traditional gender norms. I don't think that it's Married at First Sight's responsibility to censor that, even though I personally don't agree with it. I think it's important to show the people who do believe in it, and we can make up our decisions for ourselves, because the people who are leaning towards those traditional gender roles on the show, they're looking like idiots anyway. It's not being glamorized. They look like weirdos, you know? And so I don't think anyone would watch this and think, yeah, traditional masculine, and I want to be like him. So I don't think that Married at First Sight is necessarily glorifying and glamorizing those traditional ways of thinking about the old school gender roles.
So you've worked on the show, you know a lot of behind the scenes. Why do you still watch it?
Because I love it. It's so good. It encompasses everything I love about being a human, which is falling in love, falling out of love, dealing with rejection, dealing with vulnerability. I think it just shows such a great cross-section of something that we all want in life, which is partnership. And then interspersed with that, there are just so many hilarious, quirky people who are acting so outlandish. It's just so entertaining to see people behaving in such odd ways. I find it truly entertaining. I truly love it. I love people acting ridiculously. Look at me, I'm just laughing just thinking about it. That's why I still watch it. And that's the thing, even when I worked on it, I still watched the episodes. I still watched the episodes when they went to air, even though I'd seen them all. I still loved it. So how concocted can it be if somebody who has been behind the scenes concocting it still thinks that it's worth watching? And that's the same, like all the participants who have been on it, they still watch it themselves and they still get worked up about things they're seeing on screen. If it was so fake and not a reflection of reality at all, would they be getting drawn into, I can't believe this guy did this, and having opinions on what the participants are doing on screen? They probably wouldn't, because they'd know themselves this is just not real at all. But that's just not the case.
What would you say to someone who's thinking about going on a show like MAFS?
I would ask them to be really honest with themselves about the kind of person they are, about their level of emotional regulation and self-reflection. I'd ask them to be really honest with themselves about, is their personality the kind of personality that rubs people the wrong way? Because if you are, that's exactly what's going to happen to you when you go on MAFS. You're going to rub people the wrong way. If you're going on to genuinely find love and you don't tend to have a lot of life and relational conflicts, you might be okay. You might come out of it looking like a nice and decent person. But yeah, be really honest with yourself about how your behaviour could be perceived. I believe that if I were to go on the show, I would probably be on some level a villain, because I do have strong personalities. I am kind of outlandish. And I know that there's a chance that I could be taken out of context, even though I know that my intentions are never like that. And I have kindness, empathy, compassion, self-reflection. I know that I could get outlandish or worked up at some point, and given a few wines, I could crack it, you know? So I wouldn't go on. I wouldn't put myself through that.
I think I definitely get the villain edit as well. Alex, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you for having me.
That was Alex Funnell, co-host of the podcast That's Showbiz Baby and ex-MAFS post-producer. Let us know in our DMs at The Briefing Podcast on Instagram if you guys are watching the show, or if you're not, what do you think of the way a show is made like this? Do you agree with the ethics and morals? Do you think they go too far? Let us know. We'd love to hear your feedback. But that's it for this episode of The Briefing. We do have the weekend briefing coming in your feed tomorrow with Antoinette Lattouf interviewing Maddie McRae. She is one of the biggest TikTokers and influencers in Australia, but she dives into some deeper conversations around social media, what it's actually like to have a platform that big and if it gets you anything.
The last 12 months with being an actor has been really frustrating for me because so many people ask me, like, you've got 3.5 million followers online. Surely you're getting cast in TV and film. And I'm like, no, I'm not even getting in the audition room. I'm still not.
That chat is coming into your feed tomorrow. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.